right does the wolf judge the lion? But what right?
Up! The Kingslayer!
Jaime. My name's Jaime.
In this video, we're going to be discussing the season of Game of Thrones that changed everything for Jaime Lannister. In Season 3, we really got every version of Jaime. We get to see his darker and more antagonistic side, and we gradually are presented with all the information necessary to see how he truly is the most misunderstood character in all of Westeros. Now, if you find this video informative or entertaining, please leave it a like, and to stay up to date with future content just like this and more, make sure you're subscribed. Now, without further ado, let's get started. This is Jaime Lannister, Season 3. When we last saw Jaime, it was revealed that Catelyn had set him free and tasked Brienne with bringing him to King's Landing, where he will ultimately free Catelyn's daughters and send them home. So at the beginning of this video, I said we still get to see an antagonistic version of Jaime. And when we first see him in Season 3, he wastes no time in delivering on that as he insults Brienne and attacks a sore spot for her by speaking unfavorably of Renly Baratheon. As Brienne served in Renly's Kingsguard, and she secretly loved Renly, this really touched a nerve for her. It's important to note that a commoner comes across Jaime and Brienne. Once he leaves them, Jaime suggests that they should kill him, or he might tell someone that he saw Jaime. Brienne refuses and says the man is innocent. Jaime responds with a rhetorical question asking if he's more innocent than Lady Catelyn's daughters. For better or worse, Brienne is morally opposed to killing the man, where Jaime is not. At a bit of a crossroads, the two of them come across a river. Now there's a bridge that makes it safer to cross, but they also risk being seen. They could try and trek the river, but there's the risk of them drowning, or Jaime even using this as an opportunity to escape. Jaime teases Brienne about this dilemma, and they ultimately take the bridge. Once on the bridge, Jaime fakes some soreness in his foot, complaining about corns, and he states he needs to rest and literally drops to the ground. When Brienne goes to pick him up, he takes this opportunity to steal a sword from Brienne and ultimately frees himself. I think a lot of people look at this scene as a way to gauge Jaime as a fighter versus Brienne, and I'll touch on that in just a moment, but I want to point out to you Jaime's mindset in all of this. He's been labeled as a man without honor and an oathbreaker for so long. I do believe a part of him believes this and has even embraced it. He made an oath to Catelyn to return her children, yet he's trying to escape from his escort. If he were to successfully defeat Brienne or escape, I don't think he intends to uphold that oath to Catelyn, at least not at this point. As I stated before, he's still an antagonist in the beginning of this season, and I think the only evidence needed to support this is if Jaime had intended on upholding that oath to Catelyn, why would he want to escape from Brienne, who's been tasked with escorting him? I think he wants to be a good and honorable man, but he's clearly still in great conflict with himself. As the two are fighting on the bridge, a fight that Jaime is clearly losing, they're interrupted by the show-only character Locke, who's leading a group of Bolton men. The commoner from the last scene is brought up to identify Jaime, proving Jaime's suspicions true from before. There's some back and forth and attempted bribes, but ultimately Jaime and Brienne are taken captive by Locke. And Locke being a show-only character is one thing that really shows the thought and care that went into the earlier seasons. When they made changes to the source material, whether those changes worked or not, you can clearly see that the intent was to enhance the source material. As the season progresses, Jaime may not always be in the right, but a character like Locke really allows you to differentiate between a purely evil character and someone who's clearly at odds with themselves like Jaime. Where Locke is ruthless, Jaime seldom is presented as a character acting with malicious intent. Obviously, George R.R. Martin does this in numerous other areas of A Song of Ice and Fire, but I think the show did a great job demonstrating this point for Jaime in Game of Thrones. Villains and heroes are all presented on a spectrum. You may disagree with their actions, but you understand the motives of Cersei, Jaime, Mance Rayder and the Wildlings, Stannis Baratheon, the Hound, Littlefinger, and Varys are also very nuanced. But when you compare these types of characters with, say, Ramsay, Joffrey, or the Mountain, and of course Locke in Jaime's story, those characters leave little to no room for empathy. and Locke draws a greater contrast here soon in Season 3. But we get Jaime in a very human moment when he and Brienne are both tied together on a horse as Locke's prisoners. Brienne questions the legacy of Jaime's sword fighting. Now, Jaime had been in prison for a year and handcuffed during the fight, but regardless, Jaime is triggered by Brienne's questioning his capabilities, and that's when he informs Brienne that she's to be raped once making camp. It starts out as taunting at first, I think, but then Jaime pleads with Brienne not to fight them or risk being killed. Brienne has no intentions of being submissive. As predicted, once they make camp, we're presented with Locke and his men wasting no time, just as Jaime had claimed. Locke's men drag Brienne off into the woods, kicking and screaming. It's everything Jaime has witnessed about Brienne to this point that I think maybe he doesn't quite care for her too strongly just yet, but I do believe a bit of admiration is setting in for him, and his compassion for the innocent or otherwise begins to show. Brienne doesn't deserve this. She's guilty only of upholding an honorable oath to Catelyn. Jaime speaks up. He informs Locke that Brienne is a noble woman from Tarth, and that Tarth is called the Sapphire Island due to every sapphire in the Seven Kingdoms being mined on Tarth. This, of course, is not true, and becomes important later. Jaime states that Lord Selwyn Tarth would pay his daughter's weight in sapphires if she's not defiled and returned. This actually works. Brienne is brought back and tied back up. But then Locke begins to question if Tywin would pay Jaime's weight in gold too. So this is interesting when we try to gauge Locke as a villain, because you could argue that what happens next is due strictly to Jaime overplaying his hand, no pun intended, but I'm not so sure. Obviously there is a bit of arrogance from Jaime when he states that fighting for a losing cause, that being the North, is noble, but fighting for a winning cause is far more rewarding. Jaime asks if he can be released from the tree and kept elsewhere so he can sleep lying down. Locke agrees and even offers Jaime something to eat. In Jaime's mind, he's convinced Locke to cooperate and betray the North. But Jaime must have forgot what Locke told him before when presented with the opportunity to let him go and be rewarded by Tywin. Locke believes that he'd be beheaded if the king in the North knew he had captured the Kingslayer and let him go. This kind of torture seems prominent with those from the Dreadfort or those serving the Boltons. Obviously, Ramsay does something similar in this season by pretending to free Theon just to manipulate him back to the Dreadfort to be tortured more. Well, Locke is cut from the same cloth. I don't think he ever intended to free Jaime, and a part of me thinks that no matter what Jaime did or said, he was going to torture Jaime regardless, one way or another. And then it happens. Locke threatens Jaime, insults him for essentially being a spoiled son of Tywin, and ultimately chops off Jaime's sword hand. This moment, I believe, and I'm sure many others see it similarly, is the moment of liberation for Jaime, even if he doesn't know it yet. It changes everything, because what it creates for Jaime is pure vulnerability unlike anything he's ever experienced. We next see Jaime with his severed hand tied to the front of him, and he looks almost lifeless. He falls from his horse, stopping the party. When Locke and his men approach, Jaime begs for water, only to have one of Locke's men empty a canteen of water on his head. Locke then apparently takes sympathy and offers Jaime what appears to be water, only to reveal that it's horse urine. The torment toward Jaime is becoming brutal. When one of the men go to pull Jaime up, the former Kingslayer steals this man's sword and learns quite quickly how inept of a swordsman he is without his sword hand. Locke's men circle Jaime and eventually knock him down. I think Brienne does a good job of displaying the emotions of the audience here. This merciless torment of Jaime has been more than enough, and for the first time, many audiences begin to take pity on Jaime Lannister. Most people can only handle seeing a man kicked while he's down for so long, before emotionally we feel as Brienne did when she hopped off her horse to try and stop the cruelty towards Jaime. The next time we see Jaime, he's a defeated man, and he believes he's dying, or he's at least given up his desire to live. That is until Brienne confronts him when he states that he's lost his sword hand.
You have a taste. One taste of the real world, where people have important things taken from them, and you whine and cry and quit. sound like a bloody woman.
Jaime shows just a small glimpse that he believes perhaps Brienne is right. He eats, maybe reluctantly, but he eats. Now, whether you're familiar with the books or not, I do think that pointing out that Locke is a show-only character with what appears to only be cruel and malicious intent serves the show specifically well. As in the books, the brave companions and a man named Vargo have a much more political role to play in Jaime's capture and ultimately his well-being. I think this is an interesting subplot spanning across a clash of kings and a storm of swords, even intertwining a bit with Arya's plot. But for the show, there's obviously numerous changes, and I'm not saying Locke is a better character or anything like that. But I think for the more compressed story they're telling in the show, Locke works really well, as his motives for contempt toward Jaime appear to be envy, but it's left kind of vague and mysterious. And not knowing what his true values are or what motivates his brutality made for a much more menacing protagonist against Jaime. Again, to book readers, I'm not saying this is better, I'm just saying I like how it was done if we look at the show in a vacuum. And it was things like this that were done really well that make the later seasons so baffling. Because very high quality writing went into these show-only characters and show-only situations. The same D&D behind Season 8 were also behind the decision to switch Arya's time as Roos's cupbearer to her being Tywin Lannister's cupbearer instead. These are just some thoughts I have going through Season 3 here for Jaime, and I apologize if we got off topic a bit, but now back to Jaime here, arriving in Harrenhal as Locke's captive. Roose is immediately displeased to see Jaime has lost his hand, so much so he threatens Locke for suggesting that he'd send Jaime's hand to Tywin. Now, if you're purely a show watcher, this might be the first moment that you're starting to catch on to the idea that something may be a bit off with Roose Bolton. And in rewatches, this all becomes much more obvious when you look back on Season 2. But this video's focus is Jaime. Now, the little pep talk he received from Brienne looks like it may have began to wear off a bit here. When first presented to Roose, Locke kicks Jaime face first into the mud, putting an exclamation mark on Jaime's defeated persona. Jaime asks about the status of King's Landing, and Roose toys with Jaime here a bit, and you can see it on Brienne's face that if Jaime hears tragic news about Cersei, that'll be the nail in the coffin for Jaime's spirit. Finally, Roose reveals that the crown prevailed against Stannis in the Battle of the Blackwater. Jaime finally has some relief, and collapses. The scene with Jaime and Qyburn is still a bit of a mystery to me even on the 30th viewing. Jaime finally has access to healthcare, water, and nourishment, not to mention a chance to properly bathe for the first time in what is almost a year in the show. And yet when Qyburn recommends severing the arm at the elbow, Jaime refuses. When Qyburn recommends a far more painful method, which is cutting out the corruption and burning the stub with boiling wine, Jaime accepts. When Qyburn encourages the use of milk of the poppy, Jaime refuses. It's maybe a pride thing to save as much of the arm as possible, but the insistence of feeling that pain without milk of the poppy I think is something to offer more of a commentary on Jaime for the audience. A rebuttal if we as an audience still question Jaime's courage or bravery. I go back to Season 1 when Ned suggests that Jaime chose his opponents wisely. After countless views of this scene, I do believe this is more of a statement to the audience and to remove any doubt about Jaime's strength or courage. It's like the Rocky line. It's not about how hard you can hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep going. We've already given Jaime our pity. Now I think the show is trying to persuade us into giving him our admiration for his strength, even if it is foolish or stubborn. Regardless, the rebuttal to Eddard Stark stating he chose his opponents wisely, I think is finally being made. A man who fears the potential harm he could receive in battle, I don't believe would subject himself to this level of physical pain. Let me know in the comment sections what you think about this scene, but just remember how you viewed Jaime the first time in Season 1 as an almost Prince Charming appearance to now. This bath scene with Brienne is everything, because it dismisses the misconception about Jaime that viewers have held since the start of the series. And what Jaime shares with Brienne could easily be accused of being a lie. Nobody felt that way that I know of. As an audience, we were right there with him in his most vulnerable of moments, and that led us to give him much more credibility. Watching him survive the torment from Locke and having pity for Jaime really made the audience feel closer to him, which allowed this scene to be not only his most vulnerable in the series, but also insisted that the audience pivot on their prior opinion of Jaime. Jaime reveals that the Mad King had orchestrated to have wildfire settled throughout the entire city. He described how his father, Tywin, arrived with the Lannister army, claiming to defend the city, but Jaime also states that he knew his father better than that, and his father wouldn't pick the losing side. What's interesting is that Jaime claims that he warned the Mad King that his father would betray him, and Jaime encouraged him to surrender while he could. Jaime explains that the king ignored his warning. For what it's worth, he also ignored Varys' warning as well. Instead, Aerys Targaryen put his faith in Grand Maester Pycelle, who insisted that the Lannisters have always been true friends of the crown. Listening to Pycelle, Aerys opened the gates to the Lannister army, and the Lannister army sacked the city, betraying Aerys. After this, Jaime encouraged the Mad King once more to surrender, Aerys responding by commanding Jaime to bring him his father's head. Then he turned to his pyromancer and commanded him to burn them all. Jaime states that he responded by killing the pyromancer, and when Aerys turned to flee, he drove his sword into his back. Delusional, the Mad King thought he turned into a dragon if everyone, including himself, were burned, as he kept yelling, "Burn them all." Jaime slit his throat to make sure that didn't happen. And that's when Ned Stark arrived. For the audience of the show and for readers, this felt like a confession, which immediately made it feel very credible to us. Nobody questions it. The reason why is because it was a confession. Jaime has lived with this for almost 20 years. I don't believe Cersei knows this story. I don't think anyone has ever heard this story. And as it's presented, we don't know if Pycelle or Varys witnessed this, but I imagine they took for shelter when the city was sacked. I think you have to believe that, because Pycelle appearing to be a loyalist to the Lannisters doesn't seem like he'd keep this secret from Tywin. And I can't imagine Tywin would allow his family name to be smeared with Jaime being labeled an oathbreaker. But then again, he stated his desire for his family to be feared, regardless of what else is thought of them. The show doesn't elaborate. But that was the moment. Everything changed for Jaime when he lost his hand, but now everything about how the audience perceived Jaime changed with his confession to Brienne. And that experience so greatly displays why this character is so conflicted, and why in earlier seasons he's so critical of honor, duty, and loyalty. Next, things with Roose Bolton become a bit more clear, and this scene isn't super important as far as character development for Jaime, but to summarize, Roose informs Jaime that he will allow him to travel safely back to King's Landing as restitution for Locke cutting off his hand. One condition being that Jaime informs Tywin that Roose had nothing to do with Jaime's injuries. The one bit about Jaime here is that he insists Brienne accompanies him, to which Roose refuses. Jaime, not exactly in the strongest position, concedes the debate. Now, before Jaime leaves Harrenhal, he visits Brienne for what appears to be the last time. Jaime informs Brienne that she will be left with Locke in Harrenhal, as Roose Bolton is leaving for Edmure Tully's wedding. He also makes a point to Brienne that he owes her a debt. Brienne only wants Jaime to fulfill the promise that they both made to Catelyn, which is to return her daughters. If Jaime does this, Brienne will consider the debt paid. Jaime swears to do just that. Earning more admiration from Brienne, she finally calls him Sir Jaime, and he leaves the room. In the books, Jaime truly does admire, if not idolizes, Brienne for the knight that she would be. But the kind of warrior she is. She's purely motivated by honorable and objectively good intentions. It's more subtle with the exchange of looks that Jaime gives her in the show, but I think it conveys the same message, and I think that helps guide Jaime here in just a couple scenes later. One small moment when Jaime is leaving, Roose asks Jaime to send his father Tywin his regards. Jaime asks Roose to tell Robb Stark he's sorry he couldn't make his uncle's wedding, and to let him know that the Lannisters send their regards. For book readers, this moment has much deeper implications going forward, but in the show, it's inconsequential. On the way out, Locke makes one last comment to Jaime about Brienne, stating that they'll take good care of her. We'll soon see what that means. Now, over some small talk with Qyburn, Jaime more directly states that he saved the population of King's Landing. But what's more important in this conversation with Qyburn is that Qyburn informs Jaime that Selwyn Tarth offered to pay a ransom for his daughter Brienne. Now, due to Jaime's fabricated story about the Sapphire Island, Locke will refuse the offer of 300 gold dragons as he believes he's being cheated, since Jaime convinced him that Tarth owns all the sapphire mines in Westeros. Upon learning this, Jaime demands they return to Harrenhal. Once they arrive, we discover what Locke had planned for Brienne. They put her in a pit with a bear with nothing to defend herself with other than a wooden sword. Jaime decides to become the man that audiences have begun to wonder if he might be, and he jumps into the pit to aid Brienne and try to save her. The plan is shaky at best, but fortunately, the Bolton men tasked with bringing Jaime to King's Landing don't want to be held accountable for Jaime's death, and they shoot an arrow into the bear, giving Jaime and Brienne just enough time to escape. This creates division between the Boltons, but ultimately, the division that is taking Jaime to King's Landing wins out, and Locke ultimately backs down. But this is good for developing further the notion that Jaime is a man with some honor and good intent. We've heard him say he saved people, but now we actually get to see him put himself between Brienne and an angry bear, risking his life for hers. You see, good and evil is on a spectrum, and while Jaime may have been in the middle to evil end of that spectrum starting out, having the sinister nature of a character like Locke firmly placed far over to the evil end of the spectrum, Jaime has been able to contrast that and has solidified his position as moving to the good end of the spectrum, if he may have only been in the middle, at best, before. Jaime ends Season 3 back in King's Landing, a far different character than he was when we last saw him, here as he goes to see Cersei. It's a funny thing. The clean armor, perfect hair, clean-shaven face of Jaime in Season 1 was viewed as one of the worst kinds of villains, shoving a boy from a tower, and when he looked his best, we saw him as a vile character. Compare that to where he ends here, dirty, beaten, hand-severed, and poorly groomed, and yet now he's viewed as a well-meaning good guy. I think Jaime is easily one of the greatest portrayals and really an accomplishment in storytelling. But his redemption arc is far from complete, as he still has a promise to uphold and a reputation to rebuild. And I look forward to discussing this with you in my next video in this series that will cover Season 4. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, found it informative or entertaining, please leave it a like, and to keep up with more content like this, please consider subscribing. I appreciate you taking your time for my video much more than I can express. Thank you.